Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining MDRC's Jobs Plus webinar. My name is Donna Wharton-Fields, and I work in MDRC's New York office. For those who don't know, MDRC is a social policy research firm. We design interventions, evaluate programs, or provide technical assistance to build better programs and deliver effective interventions at scale. We also work as an intermediary, bringing together public and private funders to test new policy-relevant ideas. And as we're doing today, we're committed to communicating what we learn to policymakers and practitioners such as you. We're involved in this work with the goal of improving the lives of low-income individuals, families, and children. Today, we're going to share lessons from our experience providing technical assistance for Jobs Plus replication efforts. We're not going to spend a lot of time describing the program model. There are a number of resources on MDRC's website that you can review to learn about the origins of the model and the research findings. For the purposes of this discussion, we assume that you have a basic understanding of the model, which is also described in HUD's NOFA. We will focus discussion around aspects of model implementation and service delivery that in our experience have been important opportunities for learning. MDRC hasn't provided technical assistance to Jobs Plus replication efforts alone. Over the years, we've engaged partners. We have created a technical assistance team that is working together right now to support current Jobs Plus replication efforts. In fact, we're the only team with experience providing technical assistance on Jobs Plus replication efforts. I'd like to take a minute to introduce our partners, the Jobs Plus Assistance Team. First, Public Works Partners, based in New York City, is represented today by Scott and Allison. Workforce Professionals Training Institute, also based in New York City, is represented today by Sharon and Tirza. We've also got independent consultants that we've been working with as well. Greg, from Greg Holly Consultants, based in New York City, and John from New Paradigms Consulting, based in Connecticut, joins us. Our approach to the presentation will be as follows. We've allotted about 90 minutes for the presentation, and along the way, I'll invite members of the Jobs Plus Assistance Team to contribute. Again, our goal is to highlight things you don't know, things you may not be thinking about as you continue to work on your proposal. I'm going to ask my colleague Beatrice Gill to review the process for asking questions today during the presentation, and then we'll begin.
Hi, everyone. We encourage you to submit written questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A panel located at the bottom right of your screen. After typing your questions in the space at the bottom, hit the send button, and please be sure to direct your questions to all panelists in the drop-down menu. Your questions will not be seen by other members of the audience. We'll take a couple questions at the end of the webinar as time allows. Don't worry if we are not able to respond to your questions during the webinar. All questions asked will be reviewed in writing and posted on MDRC's website early next week. Also, at the end of the presentation, we'll share contact information for MDRC and the Jobs Plus Assistance Team.
Let's take a minute to look at the topics we'll cover. We'll start with an overview of the original demonstration and then walk through the history of replicating the Jobs Plus model to date. We'll then share a few observations about how this NOFA builds on prior replication efforts. But what we really want to get to is sharing implementation lessons. We'll cover the following topics. We'll start with program launch, things you should keep in mind as you plan for that, the beginning of your program. We'll then move to management and accountability, followed by outreach and engagement. We'll then focus on the three components of the model: employment-related services and training, financial incentives, and community supports for work. And finally, we'll touch on collaboration and governance. We'll end by pointing you to some of the resources on MDRC's website and then wrap things up. As background, I'd like to quickly share highlights from the original demonstration. It's important to note that Jobs Plus was the first ever rigorously evaluated employment program based in public housing communities. So there's a great deal of confidence in the evaluation results. Jobs Plus was developed by MDRC, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Rockefeller Foundation, and other funders in the late 1990s with the goal of improving employment-related outcomes, The model was designed to address such issues as joblessness, underemployment, and poverty in public housing communities. As you know, the model has three components: employment-related services and training, financial incentives that make work pay, and community support for work. All Jobs Plus services are to be delivered at saturation levels, which really means that all residents of targeted development should be exposed to the program in some way, even if they don't come into the program office. Another important feature of the model is the collaborative governance structure. And as you know, this is needed to maintain a focus on performance accountability and also to ensure that your program has relationships with organizations that can partner in the delivery of the extensive array of services you will want to provide to your community. So the original demonstration was started in 1998, and it was launched in 6 cities: Baltimore, Chattanooga, Dayton, Los Angeles, St. Paul, and Seattle. Most of the program sites operated in relatively small developments with units in the hundreds, not thousands. They were mostly at mid-rise buildings. The programs operated for 5 years, after which MDRC's impact analysis showed that in the developments where all 3 components of the model were fully implemented, residents' average earnings increased substantially, about 14% when compared with residents of comparison developments. Important to note that this positive earnings trend continued after the demonstration project was over. And it's really on the basis of the strength of these results that the Jobs Plus model has been replicated. The first formal replication took place here in New York City and was sponsored and funded by the New York City Center for Economic Opportunity. There was one program site located in Jefferson Houses, which is in East Harlem. And New York City's perspective on this project was really to see whether this model could be replicated here in New York City. Jefferson Houses has much larger developments than the original demonstration, so that was one of the major hurdles that they were trying to take a look at. Important to note that Jefferson Houses is still operating as part of a larger initiative here in New York City, which I'll mention in a moment. The second replication was also sponsored by New York City Center for Economic Opportunity, but it was funded by the Corporation for National and Community Service as part of the Social Innovation Fund. This replication was launched 2 years later in 2011 in 2 locations, one of them in New York City at an organization named BronxWorks, which is a community-based organization in the Bronx. The second is located in Texas and is operated by the San Antonio Housing Authority. So what's interesting about this replication is that 2 different types of institutions are implementing the model: a CBO and a public housing authority. Like Jefferson Houses, what's happening in these 2 sites is taking place at much larger developments, thousands of units as opposed to hundreds. An innovation that has happened with the 5th replication is that we've been able to add to the model, we've been able to add financial counseling. That's happening only in New York City as a result of some special private funding. I also want to mention that MDRC is conducting implementation research and a cost analysis of this replication effort. So please look out for our report. It'll be ready mid-2015. We've got your names. We'll put you on the distribution list. Finally, I want to mention another CEO-sponsored replication as part of New York City's Young Men's Initiative. This is happening right now at 8 sites, including Jefferson Houses, throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City. This initiative has been underway for about a year and a half, and all the sites are run by community-based organizations that are under contract with New York City's Human Resources Administration, the city's welfare agency. Financial coaching continues in this model as well, and I want to mention that there's a very high-functioning collaborative at work here, with multiple city agencies involved, and there's alignment across the agencies on the vision and the program priorities and a shared interest in having this initiative succeed. And this is what we like to see as replication at scale. Which really brings us to the HUD NOFA, the current opportunity. Each of the replications that I've mentioned thus far has built on and learned from the prior effort, and each has generated model enhancements that help us learn more about the potential of Jobs Plus to make a difference in the lives of public housing residents and their communities. Plus, NOFA will result in the selection of the next generation of Jobs Plus program operators, and they, no doubt, will teach us even more. So quick observations about the model components before we jump into the details. Employment-related services and training. And these observations are about what's discussed in the NOVA. You all know that you're required to formally partner with USDOL through the American Job Centers. In all prior replications, this has been a challenge. So your efforts to make this happen will be an important contribution to our understanding of what's possible. With regard to financial incentives, with the exception of what's possible at MTW sites, the Jobs Plus EID under the NOFA is much more generous than the standard earned income disallowance. And it's been crafted to address some of the challenges we know exist with the implementation of the standard EID. For example, the Jobs Plus EID remains in effect for the entire HUD grant period, and it's also available to those who have already used up their standard EID eligibility. With regard to community supports for work, there's a clear emphasis in the NOFA on the role of residents in your plans, and there is language stressing that sustainability is also important. So be sure to give these issues careful consideration. And for collaboration, this remains a core requirement of your program, as does the importance of working as intensively with residents as you can. So now we're going to jump into the meat of our presentation and talk a bit about these content areas that were mentioned earlier. I'm first going to ask Greg to speak. He'll start our discussion with a focus on two important topics that you've certainly already considered: your program office and your staff team. Some of you will have on-site facilities, while others may be planning to operate off-site within a short distance from your development. So we're going to share our sense of what's most important to think about when outfitting your program office. And on the issue of staffing, we'll talk about our experience working directly with program directors and frontline staff.
Thanks, Donna. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Holly. I'm going to be speaking first on program launch and then transitioning into outreach and engagement. Just some key points with regards to facility and neighborhood context, which are critical to this model. In my first bullet, obviously, location is critical. Location, we hear that all the time. It plays out quite critically in this model. Location of your program, there's going to be obviously some limitations in determining the actual space you're going to be able to utilize, but it's critical to consider where you're going to place this facility and program with regards to accessibility of the members. When we're thinking about that, some key observations that we've seen is if the program is not directly in the vicinity of the housing authority, then there's going to be some key challenges in terms of accessing this space. Some other key things to think about as it relates to facility are, and we've seen this in the past, is the difficulty of potential members accessing a space based upon perceived fracturing or segmenting of a community. So, for example, we've seen instances with programs in which a program had a division, up the hill or down the hill, or this side or that side, and it directly caused, had an impact on the ability to outreach to those potential members and the accessibility and the intake of those members in terms of receiving services. With regards to creating a professional community space, as you can see, community is in quotes because this Jobs Plus model is really about creating a professional environment to allow members and potential members to flourish and to grow, receive the opportunity for employment and all of the other great outcomes that this Jobs Plus model has to offer. But there are some critical things that you have to think about before operationalizing the program. The first thing is to make sure and ensure you have a fully functional office before the program launch. That may seem very straightforward and simple, but what does that mean? That means that all of the different components that members are looking to take advantage of, whether it's access to computers, the ability to navigate or work with staff in the capacity for applications or receiving financial services, that all of the different components that are needed are accessible within the office. And it's also just simple things like having all of the computers and the space and environment set up, all the signage and postage, all the signage for the program available, printed, and visible for the community to know where the location is. The next bullet on, does your facility align with the needs of the community demographic? What I'm really referencing there is this whole idea of understanding the demographic of the respective community, and thinking about how that plays into how you develop the components of your program and the actual environment. So thinking about parents with children, specific or enhanced need for access to computers, the office hours of the program, and how individuals can access the program. We've had programs that have utilized Saturday hours, weekend hours, late evening hours for families. And then also the general staff proximity. And so the example that I'm giving around that is this idea that staff proximity is really critical, right? So in a kind of holistic model that the Jobs Plus model is, being able to have staff in an area in which you can transition them easily from one staff member to another in terms of their functions and features. And ensuring that staff and Jobs Plus and the program environment convey success supports. So this isn't just a transactional program. There are a lot of components that individuals can take advantage of in addition to employment that they should feel supported in. And the great part about this model is that it's dedicated to provide that support. And so how does the staff and the environment express the support for things like the resources that they can access, or all of the different financial components that the potential members can take advantage of. The last bullet on this slide is build a neighborhood trust. That's really the plus of the Jobs Plus model, right? In a saturation-based, in a saturation model, which the Jobs Plus model is, you really got one or two shots to really get this right, and really building the trust in the community, and making them comfortable in understanding that, you know, this is an opportunity for a member to come in, work with staff, and take advantage of the program in a safe, comfortable environment that's going to help them to access the services to develop their professional selves and be more sustainable and self-sufficient. I'm going to move on to outreach and engagement. I'm going to ask some of my colleagues to chime in as well. So just thinking about this whole component of different messages for different audiences. This goes back to truly understanding your demographic and the respective communities. Obviously, no one message is the same. You're committing and marketing a set of services to, you know, various individuals and demos. So we're thinking about young adults who have not been employed, and how do you market a message to them? Or maybe looking for first-time job and internship opportunities, or someone who is currently employed and looking for advancement opportunities. Or how do you market the opportunity to take advantage of certain financial incentives? How do you market that to the respective populations? Establishing specific targets for outreach and engagement and enrollment to measure the effectiveness of your efforts, right? So what gets measured gets managed. We've seen in the past with programs specifically that they had some really deliberate efforts to go out and outreach and market, but without the capacity and the thoughtfulness to establish targets for the amount of people you're going to outreach to and engage, there's no way to measure the effectiveness in intake, enrollment, and retention. Looking at larger communities, and I'm going to ask my colleague Allison to chime in on this, being able to subdivide large developments into manageable sections, and thinking about the scope of having multiple buildings in larger scope communities that you're going to be working with, and how that's going to impact your outreach and engagement, and how you have to be really strategic and thoughtful about breaking up into sections targeting these particular members. Allison?
Right. So we work with one site that is actually working with 6 different buildings that are all located not close to each other at all, which obviously proposes a pretty difficult outreach challenge. And the way they've really handled that is to, first think about the community coaches that they're hiring and to make sure that they have at least one from each of those buildings, and sometimes, more than one from buildings that are particularly large, and then to really look at the number of building units they have, and can divide things appropriately so that you're covering kind of all of the areas of people that you want to cover. And, some of that's, in this case, that's really about geography, but you could also see yourself doing similar things if you know a lot about the demographics of particularly large developments, and say you have a sense that certain segments of the community live in one area versus the other. You could hire community coaches who could kind of mirror the demographics of those areas and also target your outreach to them specifically.
Another key point, thanks, Allison. Another key point, this term that I referenced called evolving engagement. And so this idea that, strategy has to evolve and shift around outreach and engagement. The example that I gave is of the iPhone, and how this is a product that's a long-standing product that's well known. How does the marketing, the engagement around this product and the excitement that you have to create around your Jobs Plus program going to evolve and change based upon seasonality, based upon the saturation in the community, and based upon people's general perceptions? It's going to be really critical to talk to the residents and see what the general feel is in the community about the program and what the needs are as they evolve throughout the program. And being able to be thoughtful and anticipate those things in advance, so being proactive and not reactive in that instance. The last two bullets I want to make mention of is just delivering quality services that make difference for a resident. That's the best way to engage them, right? And so, the best message and the best marketing is quality services. The capacity for the staff in your respective programs to deliver services is going to go really far in the community. Word travels fast. And there's nothing like bad news, as we know. So as folks are creating relationships with members in the community and delivering impactful and tangible services, that message is going to really carry forth into the community. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. I'm going to move on to management and accountability. And I'm going to ask Scott from Public Works to talk to us for a few minutes. He's going to discuss issues you're going to want to keep in mind as you think about your approach to managing a Jobs Plus program. This is an issue that our team has spent a good deal of time on with each of the replication sites. With this ambitious employment program, we've seen varying degrees of understanding of what's most important from a performance management perspective, even when performance expectations in the form of benchmarks and initiative priorities have been spelled out by the funder. So again, we've spent so much time on this, and Scott, if you could share a bit about your experience on the team supporting sites to make sure they really understand this.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. So just to really underscore Donna's point, this was something that we were very conscious of when planning the day. When talking about Jobs Plus, we often focus on the specific elements of service strategy, the three legs of the stool, the evidence basis that has been shown. But we really want to make sure that right at the outset, we call attention to the paramount importance of establishing robust program management, the management of actual service delivery on the ground, and describe what that effective management looks like in our experience with the Jobs Plus programs. And, I should say at the outset, strong program management is required for any program, but it's especially the case for Jobs Plus because there's a lot to manage. There are multiple service threads, there are multiple target populations, each that require different service strategies, there's multiple partners, and there's a need to be disciplined as you apply the evidence-based strategies and as you bring a focus to the priority areas that you have chosen. So we have to stress the need for the importance of putting thought into the management approach and making sure that it's sufficiently robust, and then paying attention to the quality of execution. One other thing I would just suggest when I look at the NOFA, I think that when you look at that capacity section, it's a real opportunity to think through not just what capacities do you have in your organization, but given your ambitions and given what you are going to run, what management capacities do you need to bring to make sure that this is successful, and recognize that that is a section with significant point value. So in our experience, what does robust Jobs Plus management look like? And I think you have to start with what you set out to focus on and how you lead. You absolutely need to bring a strategic focus on specific target populations, service needs, and service strategies. Their developments are complex places. There are lots of things going on, lots of opportunities to capitalize on, lots of service needs to meet. You have to pick your points of focus, and you have to stick to them. Once you have a plan, the other thing that we would say is that you have to bring strong accountability with data so that you know whether you're getting the job done in terms of outcomes and whether you're creating the participant experience you aim to provide. And then the other thing we would say, as we go through the service elements in subsequent slides, you're going to hear about all the things we need to think about in terms of the employment services, the incentives, the community support for work. There's a lot to pay attention to. The only way you can do it is by having leadership that's capable of delegating, but then again, you need the strong accountability so that you can make sure that those delegated responsibilities are well executed and you know where you need to do some additional coaching and some additional development. Now, Donna's asked me to speak, how we've seen this in different places, and what I would say, all of these recommendations come from a series of repeated experiences across sites where programs would go a little bit, sometimes more than a little bit, off kilter, and fundamentally what brought them all back was creating this focus, having these well-articulated strategies, having those accountability systems, and having these open and honest discussions about what's the data showing us, whether it's quantitative data or qualitative data. What is it that we need to address? What is it that we need to focus on? A few quick words on leadership. And, this perhaps should have been the starting point because, again, across all of our sites, one of the things that we've seen is that getting the leadership right is absolutely critical to making this program work. And one of the key lessons is, just as Jobs Plus has all of these different threads, and it's a very complex program, you need to have strong, multidimensional leaders that are, as I like to say, are the whole package. Leaders that can, shape the program vision, manage that service delivery and develop staff, and engage the community. We've seen this approached in a couple of different ways. It's wonderful when you can find all of that in one person, but oftentimes programs need to create complementary leadership teams. Perhaps you have directors and assistant directors. One may have an external focus. One may have an internal service delivery focus. We've even seen good models where organizations have partnered, organizations that have a particular expertise in engaging the community with organizations that have a particular expertise with service delivery. Just keep in mind, if you go that route, you absolutely have to make big investments in partnership and in coordination because that is an added complexity. Now, we've touched on a lot of these other bullets that are already here. One of the things that I would just really like to emphasize is that when you are, given that there's so much to focus on and there's so many different threads, how do you set, communicate, and adhere to focus areas and not let important elements slip? And what we have seen in some instances is that programs get caught up in employment services, so maybe community support for work takes a little bit of a back seat for a little while. A best practice is the creation of annual operating plans and referring back to those plans, actually using them and benchmarking to them over the course of the year. Plans where you fundamentally list your objectives, the initiatives, your goals, and what staff are going to do to accomplish them. And I would also say that this helps to better incorporate evidence-based practices and to understand what's working and how you're going to evolve your program. The one last final point that's on the slide that we really want to just suggest, we would suggest that all PHAs think honestly and hard about how well equipped your organization is to provide a robust level of management, and whether you might be better served to get a partner that knows the specifics of service delivery and how to manage it effectively. There is no universal right or wrong answer here. It's just a question of understanding what capacities need to be built and what's your best strategy for building them.
Thanks, Scott. So let's move on to the core components of the model: employment-related services and training, financial incentives, and community supports for work. First, we're going to hear from Sharon on employment-related services and training.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sharon with Workforce Professional Training Institute. So as we think about employment services for residents, what we've learned through our work with program providers is that program providers tend to focus a lot more on the residents and the members, and not as much on the employer customer. To be successful with the program model implementation, it's really important to consider employers as well as your residents. And so it's very critical that we engage employers in a very concrete and strategic way. We must understand their language, we must understand their needs, and we must be able to meet those needs. And in order to do so, what our programs have done successfully is really understand what is the competitive advantage of the business. How well, in terms of utilizing labor market information and data to be able to fully understand what is their hiring needs, what are the occupations that they're looking for, what are the skill sets and the educational level that they're looking for from the job seekers. It's really important to be able to analyze that data. For example, the programs that we have worked with have hired a business development person whose primary role is to develop the business opportunities and cultivate those relationships. They use a very strategic approach, inclusive of interviews, making themselves available as experts, shadowing the employer site to really understand their culture and how they operate, and specifically what do they look for in a good employee. Job coaching is another. Another program, launch a business council and really work in partnership with the employers in terms of, program hires, in terms of their expertise, leveraging their expertise and their knowledge in designing their curriculum and work readiness training, and also for mock interviews to help prepare the residents. In terms of employer relationships, please remember that many employers, many of them have never worked with nonprofits, so expect some resistance. Plan to overcome it. Think critically about your value proposition. Develop a 30 to 60 or a 90-minute pitch. Understand your brand and what that means, and really think critically about your marketing efforts. It's very different than you do for the members. In terms of developing a sector-based strategy, research has shown that a sectoral approach, again, it's not a model, but it's an approach, has been very successful in terms of targeting employers in a specific industry that pays, higher wages that also provide benefits. And so the bottom line is really understand who the employers are in your community, who is hiring, and also leverage your partnerships to think about how you can collectively be able to support that employer in terms of providing qualified candidates. And so we also encourage you to develop expertise in one or two industries so that you fully understand the breadth and depth of that employer's need or that industry need. In terms of targeting quality jobs, again, that's really important. Here in New York City, the minimum wage was raised, and programs that we are working with, job plus programs have targeted a higher wage, say starting at $10 an hour. But the bottom line is that it should, whether it's a short period of time, be able to offer the job seekers and your residents some kind of benefit that will help and move them closer to family supporting sort of wages to be able to have them either, advance or be able to move forward. Moving very quickly to the sort of the job seekers. Again, even when thinking about your employer outreach strategy, please understand your residents. Please understand your members. Please understand their educational skills, what they're in need of. In terms of your program design, when it comes to your work readiness training, think about that very critically, but also think about partners who offer basic skills training that you may be able to connect with. Or if you do it in-house, to think critically about the curriculum and how it can be responsive to and be contextualized to meet the industry needs. In terms of, again, Greg mentioned it earlier in terms of his program launch, again, residents are very critical and skeptical about any kind of program, and so we want to be able to engage them in a very meaningful way and to be able to retain them in the program. So in terms of success, ensure that your team is prepared to use a strengths-based assessment tools that properly and appropriately identify residents to meet them where they are. Many of the programs here have used a triaging strategy. And John Padilla is on the phone, and he's developed a certain approach to triaging, which is there are those who are in the survival mode, get a job right away. There are those who are entry level, those are in transition, and those who are really ready for a longer sort of career pathway. So we want to be able to understand our residents. Second, we want to be able to partner with America's Job Centers. The Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act that was just passed gives a lot more flexibility for the one-stop centers to serve, different types of populations. So you want to think critically about how their services complement yours, and be able to support your residents in a continuum of services that helps them to be job ready. Again, we want to talk more about, encourage you to think critically about your program and retention strategies, partnerships with community colleges or community-based organizations. Support services is one that members will need, specifically child care services. So please remember to be able to think about who is in your community that you could partner with, and effectively bundle your wraparound services. That's really key to preparing your residents for work, for meeting your employer's needs, and for program retention. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, who will turn over to Donna.
That's okay. That's okay. You're going in the right direction. We do want to hear next from John on financial incentives. Before we do, though, I wonder, John, is there anything else you might add to the employment-related services and training? Anything you want to emphasize?
No, I think Sharon covered that well, and if there are any questions, we can cover those in the Q&A afterward.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah.
I think Scott's going to jump in.
I would just add one point. When you take stock of the fact that these are 4-year programs, that they're place-based, and that much of your opportunity to drive economic mobility happens after that initial placement, think about long-term engagements with your participants.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, because once a member of Jobs Plus, always a member of Jobs Plus. So you've got to think about long-term ways to engage people, not only in their job, but with the program. Think creatively about how you're going to do that. I know we're going to touch on that a little bit later in more detail. So let's then move to financial incentives, and John's going to jump in and talk to us and share some lessons from our experience working with sites to implement the earned income disallowance.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. John Padilla, New Paradigms Consulting. So this feature is really what makes Jobs Plus unique from other employment and training programs and other place-based approaches. The financial incentives are a significant component of Jobs Plus, and they make a major difference in how residents view Jobs Plus because it is unique. And also, it addresses an issue which I'm sure many of you in the Housing Authority have already heard over and over, which is the complaint that will come from a resident that says, why should I bother going to work if any new money that I make is going to be eaten up by a rent increase? So, they view going to work as a disincentive. The EID, essentially takes that off the table by allowing folks to keep the additional income that's being earned when they go to work and they're members of Jobs Plus. That said, the earned income disallowance has to be managed in a timely way. In my experience, I've seen sites where residents, 6 months later, have not received an answer on the EID after they've applied. And sometimes this is just because of the bureaucracy of the Housing Authority itself, but we've also seen instances, believe it or not, where there's actual employee resistance. The employees within the Housing Authority are not all on the same page as far as the benefit of the earned income disallowance, and there are property managers who are often evaluated based on rent collection percentages and amounts, and they want to get every dollar that they feel is owed to the rent, so that becomes almost like a disincentive to them. So managing how the earned income disregard is managed in a timely way that people get it when they're supposed to, 60 days, will make a big difference in how people view Jobs Plus. If it takes an excessive amount of time, it's not going to create a good impression for the program. If it's something that's done promptly and swiftly, you'll find that it creates a very positive buzz in the development about, this is a real tangible benefit that you can get from being a Jobs Plus member. One example that I think illustrates this is one site that I've worked with where after 2 years, they had over 300 residents signed up as members, active members of Jobs Plus, but when you looked at the number of residents that have gotten the EID, it was something like 25. The executive director continually asked, what's going on? And, no one could really give this person a good answer. And eventually what the ED did was, one, called in her senior leadership team, reiterated personal commitment to Jobs Plus and the EID in particular, and basically told the director of housing, the property managers, figure this out, make it work, because this is a problem, and I see it as a problem. Staff was retrained. Staff was basically reoriented to the Jobs Plus model, why this particular housing authority felt it was an important thing for the housing authority to be doing, reiterated the components of the model, and then basically got everyone onto the same page. They retrained everyone. They kind of did a reset on the use of the EID, and voila, the approval rate pretty much moved very, very quickly. They haven't caught up, but quickly now people are getting the EID within 60 days after applying for it and having in all of their paperwork. So, it's important to understand that, building internal alignment within the Housing Authority and the commitment of staff, not just on the Jobs Plus program, but also within the property managers and the fiscal groups within the authority is important to get this model, this part of the model, to work effectively. And lastly, one word about the use of financial incentives. As Donna pointed out earlier, the more recent sites have introduced financial coaching, and we know that financial coaching is just one small piece of this work. What really makes the difference, and there's a pretty big body of evidence beginning to emerge from places like the Casey Foundation and LISC and the University of Wisconsin, folks who've really studied effective financial education and coaching is coaching makes the difference. You know, financial education gives you the information for the short term, but it's really the coaching over the longer term that helps you change habits. So to the extent that you can incorporate financial coaching and financial education into your program models, I will certainly support that and think that it will strengthen the ability of residents to better manage income once they go to work and are managing the earned income disregard in addition to this new income that's coming into the household. Thank you.
This is Donna again. I just want to jump in quickly to underscore a couple of points that John was making. With regard to staff training, in his example, don't underestimate, even with the simplifications that have been made in the Jobs Plus EID, don't underestimate the complexity of the rules associated with administering this benefit. Make sure that your staff is trained, as John mentioned, and that property management staff understand it as well. We've had instances where the Jobs Plus staff team knew more and understood the regulations more than property management staff have. So don't underestimate the complexity of the regulations and the vital importance of making sure your team and property management understand it. They should perhaps be trained together. So I just wanted to underscore that. Another dimension of the financial incentives is the importance of coming to terms, and as Scott mentioned earlier, articulating in an operational plan how you will market this benefit. John talked about this being understood as a disincentive to work, that is, work being a people not wanting to go to work because their rent would go up. Figure out as creatively as you can ways to market and inform your residents about the value of this benefit. Can't underestimate that. That's something that we continue to work to support sites to do well. Anybody else on this?
This is Scott. One other thing I would add is just remember the other work supports as well, and make sure that you build in things like the earned income tax credit, something that could potentially be the biggest check your residents will receive during the year, and something they'll become eligible for the first time if they're transitioning from unemployment to employment.
Very important, very important. We're going to start talking in a moment about community supports for work, but one thing that occurs to me is the importance of planning. Again, going back to Scott's point about the plan, so much of the work that we're talking about, so much of the dimensions of the model require, a lot of thought up front and creating, committing to certain strategies, writing them down, and just making a solid plan that you will tweak and correct along the way. The whole idea of continuous improvement is very, very important. So even though you may have made certain decisions about how you'd like to market, for example, the financial incentives, if you find that it doesn't work, you need to revisit it. So with that, let's move on and have Allison join us again and talk about community support for work.
Hello, everyone. This is Allison with Public Works Partners. So community support for work is, the third leg of the three legs of Jobs Plus. And I'm going to be honest with you, it's the most challenging of the three. In my opinion, we've seen it to be the most challenging to implement. That being said, I honestly think it has the biggest opportunity to really create lasting change in the communities that you're working in. Community support for work is really the difference between having a Jobs Plus program, help people get jobs for a few years and then leave, and really helping people and shifting the culture of a community so that work is more present, work is more normal, and then there's lasting impact on the residents' kind of economic mobility. We think of community support for work as a set of strategies that builds a culture of work within a community, really creating networks and strengthening resources where they perhaps didn't exist before. But that can be really confusing. So let's talk about what a culture of work actually means. This is a big kind of tricky question to grapple with. Culture of work is the idea that your community is set up in a way that it supports people getting jobs and then remaining in those jobs. This isn't just about the idea that, maybe people don't want to work. This is the idea that there are real factors out there in their community that are making it difficult for them to.
some of it's about changing the dialogue, right? If everyone in your neighborhood is unemployed, it is going to seem very normal for you to be unemployed. So, there's a little bit of, as people start getting jobs, as residents start getting jobs and start becoming ambassadors to the program, it creates a cycle where it becomes more exciting and more normal for people to work. That's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is, frankly, quite structural. There are neighborhoods that have really bad transportation. There are neighborhoods that have really bad child care or limited opportunities or a variety of other barriers that you could think of that would make it difficult for somebody to show up for work on time. So community support for work is really about getting to know what the needs are in your community and figuring out ways to address those needs. In order to do that, you need to talk to the residents. You need to engage the residents in any way you possibly can. You really want to go to where they are, meet them at the bus stop, go to the basketball court, go to the family day barbecues, and have conversations with people so that you really understand what do they care about, what are their concerns. Then you can ideally work with those same residents to develop strategies that will help address the things that are preventing them from getting those jobs. This is going to look a lot of different ways. I made a reference to child care. So this could be something as simple as a lot of single mothers living in the same neighborhood kind of getting together and sharing babysitting duties. This could be as simple as, carpools. There are a variety of different ways, and you're just not going to know what the need is in your community until you get in there and really start talking to people about it. Then you want to kind of test those and essentially do this over and over again. Community support for work isn't something that you create in the beginning that just stops. It's something that is ongoing. There may be a need in year one that you then somehow resolve, and then there may be a brand new need that pops up in year two. And also the people that you talk to will have different issues and concerns. So you're going to keep on evolving, testing things, trying it out, and coming up with something new. One thing I would say is to not be afraid to think outside of the box on this. The thing you need to address first, that issue may not seem like it's really focused on employment, but it could be really critical. So one example is, one of the sites that we work with, they had talked to the community and the community said, we really want these kinds of job readiness workshops. We want them on site. And they started offering them and no one was showing up. And they didn't understand why, and it turned out when they went back and had kind of another set of conversations that there was gun violence and people were concerned about going out at night. So the first thing they needed to do was figure out, okay, how do we deal with this, frankly, much larger issue, but how do we get around this as a community as something that we need to focus on first? So I would just say be willing to think pretty broadly about this. And also very much think about the role of your community coaches, who, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important for them to mirror the communities that you work in, that they're working in. But also think about how all of your staff can operate as, agents of community support for work. This isn't just one person's job. This is really about building a community and engaging your residents in a really positive way. So every staff person you're working with should kind of be involved in these efforts.
Anybody else want to jump in? Mm-hmm. One thing I'll say to add to what Allison has shared is that we sometimes think about community supports for work as the connective tissue that ties the program components together. Mm-hmm. One way to think about it as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add something also. This is John. We all know this inherently, but, work is the activity that brings rhythm to a community. People leave at a certain time in the morning, they get back at a certain time in the evening. There's less hanging out in the evening because people are just tired, they have to get up early, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, the idea of normalizing the activity of work is part of, building community support for work. That more and more people are doing this. This is something of an expectation. The kids, they see their parents, their neighbors, their friends' parents going to work. The second thing I'll add quickly is that, the idea of reducing social isolation through community supports for work. low-income people tend to have small social networks, and often when it comes to employment-related information, those networks don't provide accurate or timely information. You know, like someone will come and say, "Hey, you know, so and so is hiring," but you know what? That news is a month old, and those jobs have already been filled. Part of the intent of community supports for work is to really broaden the social networks of people who live in public housing, more than just a wave, "Hey, how you doing?" But you don't really know anything about the person who lives 2 doors down from you. To being able to create an environment where people know that folks are looking for work, and when they hear of things, they can get information to each other fairly quickly in a timely way, and it's accurate, right? So that if I'm hearing about a job at the local, department store, I can go down there and apply in time, not a month later when those jobs are already full.
And I just also want to add, and that is another strategy is as long as the resident is qualified for positions as part of the within the Jobs Plus program, it's really it has been successful and proven that if other residents see their fellow residents working and going to work, that they're able to sort of engender interest and motivation, and also demonstration that that really shows embracing the culture of work.
Thanks, Sharon. I'm going to move on to the next slide, collaboration and governance. You know, given the ambitions of Jobs Plus, it's not possible for a single agency to do all of this work alone. So forming a collaborative and engaging other partners is the only way to go. Allison's going to get us started in this discussion.
Right. So this is really about picking the right partners and then making sure you're working well with the right partners. So let's start with choosing them. This is all about knowing what it is you're trying to do with Jobs Plus and being able to identify what organizations, whether they be government organizations, nonprofits, or perhaps private organizations in your community are going to be able to offer those. You need to bring those right stakeholders to the table. That being said, we probably want this to be a fairly targeted group of people, just because, too many cooks in the kitchen can get very complicated. But what I will say is, here in New York City, what we think of as the collaborative is really a team of the city's housing authority. That makes sense, right? They're the residents. That's where the people live. The city's Human Resources Administration, which, Donna referenced earlier, is the welfare agency, but kind of most critically for this purpose, they run a lot of the welfare to work component, or all of it, for New York City. So they have a lot of workforce development experience and experience working with employers and really operate as the program manager of the program. And then the mayor's office, particularly here called the Center for Economic Opportunity, which, you can also see how it would have an important role in this situation. So it'll be important for you to think, okay, we need to get access to the residents. We want to be able to know how to work well with the residents. And we also want to be able to know how to offer these employment services. Those two things may not exist in the same agency, and to think about who are the right people to put together. Then when you create that collaborative, you want to make sure that you have a shared vision of what you're all doing. The collaborative job is really to set direction for the program in general, and to be able to say strategically, here's where we want to go, here are the outcomes that we want to achieve. So it's important that you have a sense of really where you should all land. And each of the members of the collaborative should be able to bring their own resources to the table in support of Jobs Plus. Now, in terms of how the work actually happens, some of this is about, establishing really clear goals for the partnership. Some of this is about just figuring out the nitty-gritty of how you work together. Which agencies have which roles? Who actually has decision-making authority? What's the scope of that decision-making authority? Are there certain things that the collaborative needs to decide together? And are there certain things that a lead agency can just do on their own? There are a variety of models and ways of approaching this that are perfectly acceptable. I think the thing that we would stress the most is that you just discuss it and figure that out in advance. and establish a way to work together. A key part of that is going to be figuring out how you communicate, and also really focusing on the relationships that you're kind of creating. I think, as we all know, in really any kind of program, relationships are really the name of the game. So, you know, for example, we have a lot of programs here in New York City where it's actually nonprofit providers that are providing the services, and they interact and have to interact all the time with the property management offices at the housing developments that they work at. It's really important that they create strong relationships with those people. Some of that's really formal, you know, we have monthly meetings, we have reports, we have official conversations, and some of that's like dropping by the office with some donuts and some coffee and having a conversation to understand what's going on in the development and what the needs of those property managers are, and also how, you know, they might be able to contribute to Jobs Plus. So you want to think about all of these partnerships, both in a formal and in an informal way. And lastly, I would just say that, you know, it's important to think about how the partners involved, particularly those who don't have experience working with public housing residents, how to acclimate them to working in a public housing context. Public housing, I think, as we all know, is a unique animal, and developments are very specific as well. So this may be as simple as making sure that program operators understand what the rent rules are, and how to talk to Jobs Plus members about them. This also may be things like making sure that program operators understand how to negotiate for resident associations, or how to, you know, understand if there's a variety of different kind of territories in a particular development. At least here in New York City, I think each development is its own special universe, and I imagine that's true across the country. So it'll be important to make sure to kind of acclimate the people involved in making this program happen and making it effective to whatever the nuances are of the public housing in your community.
Thanks, Allison. I just want to amplify the issue, one of the issues that's up here, up top, accountability. As Allison said, you know, you really have to understand that the collaborative also takes this on as a responsibility, holding the program accountable for a very strong performance. As a lead agency, housing authorities might be challenged at times to consider whether there are other agencies or organizations in their community that they feel comfortable having hold them accountable. But that is something that you need to really think about and consider as Allison said, developing formal and informal relationships, because anyone who's sitting around the table from you has to join that vision, has to share in the responsibility of supporting the program towards success. So if the housing authority is the lead agency, even if you sub out program services, you have to be willing to be held accountable for the performance that you all aspire to. Is there anyone else that wants to jump in on collaboration?
I just want to echo your point, Donna. You know, that for our audience listening on this webinar, that might sound a little oxymoronic, right? You're signing up to build a collaborative that's in fact going to hold you accountable for a strong program. But in the end, you know, if you pick your collaborative partners well and they work well with you, they should bring a lot of value to that table that will in fact make your work of building a strong, effective program that much easier. So it's not, we don't want to imply that this should be adversarial. It's certainly collaborative, but it's honest collaboration. When things are not going well, that we have to be able to be honest with each other and say, we have to do better for the residents that we're trying to do better for. How do we do that? Thank you.
Thanks, John. We have just a few more slides. They're more wrap up in nature, but I think we should pause at this point in the presentation and start to take a look at some of the questions that have come in. So we're going to scroll back up here in our office and see what our first question is and see if we can respond. Okay. So here's the first question. Can we receive a hard copy of the information covered during this webinar? Absolutely. This webinar has been recorded and the materials that we're all viewing together will be posted on MDRC's website tomorrow. So look out for that. We'll actually send everybody who signed up officially a link to that location on our website. So you will definitely be able to get a copy of these materials. This next question is asking about guidance on staff-resident ratios. We're thinking of 3 case managers and 3 community coaches, 3 teams, each working with about 75 residents at a time. You know what? I want to refer you to a couple of resources. And to do that, let's actually skip to that page of the presentation. If we could skip ahead 2 pages. Let me take a moment and talk about some resources. I will certainly get back to the direct question. I want to point to the MDRC's website. The URL is on the screen. This is a location of all of the reports that have been written about Jobs Plus. These 2 I'm pointing to in particular, the one on the left, the red one, is the comprehensive final report that goes into lots of detail about the research design, the methodology, and the results. The second one, the bluish-green one, is a guide to operating a Jobs Plus program. And that's a really good resource to look to get, for example, descriptions of the types of roles that you'd like to have at a Jobs Plus, on a Jobs Plus team. And you have mentioned them, case managers and community coaches. Those are among the types of positions that are described, and some numbers are given, I believe, generally. So I want to point you to those resources, the blue one in particular, because it does talk about staff positions. I think that when we, as I mentioned, we're going to list all of these questions and write responses to each of them in detail. And I think this is one where we will say a lot more in writing than we will verbally, but I invite my colleagues to respond now.
One thing I would think about, I mean, the first thing I'll say is instinctively, that seems fine. Yeah. Like, that's a totally reasonable, like, in many ways, generous ratio, I think. One of the things that I would think about when you're thinking about kind of your resident to staff ratio is, what do you really expect the staff to be doing with these residents, and what's the intensity of that activity? So in this example, if each team is working with about 75 residents, like all 75 residents will not need the same intensity of services. Some of them, may need a lot of help, a lot of job readiness help, a lot of, potential help alleviating other barriers that have, that aren't as directly related to the job, but are critically important to alleviate before getting to the job. Whereas others may need, a smaller amount of services, kind of what we sort of colloquially often refer to as fast tracking. They may need, just some like resume help, some interview brush-up, and some connections to employment. Those 2 scenarios, those people are going to require a lot, very significantly different resources from your staff, and therefore just frankly time. So I would just think about that as like, what do you really expect the people to be doing as you think about these ratios?
And I would also think about, in terms of the total number of residents within sort of the housing development, because that's really important. We could say, yes, 3 case managers and 3 community coaches sounds great, but if your housing development, is, 6 to 8 buildings and the number of residents there, that ratio may not seem appropriate. So again, it looks, you really have to think through the total number of residents and also your strategy in terms of engagement. That's really important as well.
Right. And this is Scott from Public Works Partners. I would just add, just as Allison was saying, you need to think about what these staff will be doing in terms of service provision. You also need to think about the relationship of the staff to the account managers or the job developers. What's the split in responsibilities going to be? That is a big impact. And keep in mind, you may want to plan special initiatives at various points in time, either to capitalize on opportunities in the community, new businesses opening, or you may want special service tracks for subpopulations, and you need to just think about the capacity to pull those together.
Thanks, Scott. So let me just take a step back and list really quickly the types of roles that all of us are used to seeing in a Jobs Plus program. Certainly there's the director, the person in charge, and we often, as Scott mentioned earlier, see an assistant director. In addition, we often find someone who's in charge of community outreach and engagement, someone whose focus is really community support for work, despite the fact that Allison said correctly that it is everyone's job. We often call that person a community outreach coordinator. Another key staff role is that of someone focused on training. They work in partnership with case managers, or what we have come to understand them to be called, resource coordinators. And as Scott mentioned, the account managers or the job developers, the people with a primary connection with employers. And then last but not least, our coaches, the residents who the team has hired to represent the program in the community when they go home, on the weekends, after hours, the face of the program when the staff aren't there. Another thing I want to mention about staffing is that one of the things we learned early on in the replication efforts was the importance of trying to identify individuals for staff roles who are going to be credible to residents. So in many cases, the staff teams that we work with, the staff come from the development. They come from the neighboring community. They are of the ethnic or racial makeup of the residents that they are likely to serve. So even just walking into the building and having a resident sit with them, there's some immediate credibility that's established. So you want to, in thinking about staff, not only think about the kind of role, the division of labor, as Sharon said, a number that will allow you to adequately serve however many people are in the developments where you're working, but these other factors are also important. And when we put together our responses to these questions, we'll be sure to add a little bit more detail there. So we're just moving down to the next question, and it is, we know that Jobs Plus does not want us to pay for services available in the community, but Goodwill has some great programs for folks who have really had trouble holding on to a job. Do you think there would be a problem if we paid for some specialized services?
So before we begin to answer this question, I think one thing that's very important is for us to make sure that everybody on the call understands that questions of this sort really need to be put to HUD, and we can't interpret what is going to be allowed and what's not going to be allowed. Now, that said, if you read the NOFA, and if you think about what we've seen in terms of best practices, it is a viable strategy. It is an accepted strategy to have a relationship with a service provider. You can contract with a service provider to provide these services. Now, the specifics of how that gets parsed is something that HUD would have to speak to, but to the extent that this seems like a good strategy, I would strongly encourage you to investigate it and pursue the possibility.
Yeah, I'd like to add a different perspective on that. So, for instance, Goodwill is known for its career academies, which are typically sector approach programs. I would see a situation like that as the goal of the Jobs Plus program in the development would be to make sure that they can get residents up to the point where they can get accepted into the good career academy that Goodwill offers. Goodwill is always looking for good, program participants that can take the training and complete. So to the extent that the Jobs Plus program can become a feeder for Goodwill and be able to prepare residents with some basic skills, reading, writing, math, that they can then enter the career academy and succeed, that is another viable strategy that doesn't even require paying Goodwill or subcontracting with Goodwill. It's really becoming a feeder program.
Thanks, John. One of the questions is asking us to define EID. Sorry for the acronym, but it's HUD's Earned Income Disallowance, current policy. And the NOFA makes clear that what should be used now, or for this opportunity, is what is being called the Jobs Plus Earned EID. That's what the NOFA says.
Right. But I would just, fundamentally, if it wasn't clear, this is a HUD incentive that will allow you, for the purposes of this program, to freeze participants' rent so that you can do away with that disincentive to seeking employment or seeking better employment.
Okay. we're getting a number of questions that, as Scott has mentioned earlier, we're really not eligible to respond to. But when we publish these questions on our website, we'll include them. And you'll note that we won't respond, but that will be your signal that those are questions that you should get back to HUD to answer. I'm just looking down the list. Still looking. I'm not seeing much more that we can respond to. Again, I think most of these questions are ones that you have to ask HUD about. Does anyone have a different view?
No, I think we could, this one that came in recently about NYCHA,
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's more of a clarification.
So the question is, why did NYCHA not include its local WIB in its current Jobs Plus type program model?
Right, and I think this is just a clarification based on the way the local WIB is structured here in New York City. For all intents and purposes, the local WIB is engaged, but the WIB itself is a policy oversight body. They do not directly oversee the one-stops, or the WIA-funded services, the welfare to work services. So all of the city agencies that operate those programs are engaged in the collaborative we were speaking about before, with the WIB's overall approval and policy directives as to how to coordinate together. Well, I think it's different. Yeah.
Okay. So I think most of these questions, again, are ones that will require HUD to respond to. We will have a comprehensive list. We'll get it to you as mentioned before. But let me go back a couple of slides, if I could.
How many? What do you want?
Right here. I wanted to take a minute to remind you of who's been on the call today, the Jobs Plus Assistance Team, MDRC's colleagues in providing technical assistance on Jobs Plus replication efforts. Their contact information is here, and every one of these people has been on the call today. So I want to just pause here for a sec to give you this information. Again, it'll be available on our website. Please continue to ask us questions. We've got a few more minutes to be on the line. And I'm just continuing to look to see if there are any other questions that we can answer.
Yeah. Donna, there was this one question about if there's rent incentives other than the EID, and I'd like to just answer that one a little bit differently. In our experience with the replications, we have worked with the EID, but I want to emphasize the point that we made earlier, that is one of several that's one of several work supports that you can bring to bear. So that, if you think about how you want to use these different incentives, the EID will prevent rent from going up, prevent that disincentive from happening. But then you want to think about the Earned Income Tax Credit. You want to think about SNAP. You want to think about a number of different work supports that you can bring to bear to increase total household income.
Absolutely. That's a part of the wraparound services that was mentioned on one of the slides earlier. You want to think critically about all the needs that your residents are going to have. And the list that Scott just rattled off is a short list.
Right.
And you want your program to be known as somewhat of a one-stop shop where residents can come, it's close to home, take advantage of place. That's so important with this model. This is a place-based model. You want to meet people where they are. And so you have to think expansively about the range of services that folks are going to need. Something that I want to emphasize with regard to employment-related and training services is that this is something I talk to John about a lot, and I might ask him to comment on this. That is the importance of having basic math and reading skills efforts available on site. John, can you talk about that for a little bit?
Sure. The obvious thing is the economy has changed, right? In Jobs Plus and the first implementations back in the late 90s, it was reasonable to basically provide people a little bit of training and then place them in a job, and the economy was moving pretty well. they could stick, if they could, basically get to work and businesses were hiring. There was plenty of work. Today, the nature of work has changed. The kinds of jobs that are available have changed. Everything needs higher order skills. So I would really encourage, and I've encouraged the sites that I've worked with to really think about using basic skills as the foundation of your employment training program. And by basic skills, I'm talking about getting people up to a minimum of 10th grade proficiency in reading and math. Because without that, you're going to wind up seeing them over and over again because they're not going to be able to get into better paying jobs. We're trying to move people to work that can support a family. And eventually, a lot of the PHAs would like to see people move out of the housing developments, right? So that public housing is used was intended to. That it's a place you live for a fixed amount of time, and you move on to something better. It doesn't become something that is lifetime. So really, using basic skills and a focus on literacy and numeracy as the foundation to help people really, build economic mobility because they can get better jobs and they're trainable for better jobs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to chime in to address the question around would apprenticeship programs be considered or be included as job training? While again that is a question that should be specifically addressed to HUD, I will say this: in terms of the Workforce Innovations and Opportunity Act that was just passed, there is more flexibility for job training programs to consider apprenticeships as a industry sort of focus training to help participants, especially along that career sort of mobility pathways. So that's something to be considered. However, I would still ask HUD to address this specific questions, and also think about your American Job Centers and sort of the strategies and the approaches they're using to see if that aligns or that's available as part of the program.
Thanks, Sharon. I'm looking at the clock, and I noticed that we've got just a few minutes left, and there's a question that's asking us to talk for a couple of minutes about some best practices that we've all seen in each of the model components, as well as in saturation and accountability and collaboration. So we're going to take a couple of minutes to do that quickly. Why don't we start with employment-related services and training, building on what John said moments ago about math and reading. So can we just think for a couple of minutes about some best practices that we've seen, sites that we've worked with that have done a good job delivering these services? Anything that we haven't already mentioned?
So again, without getting into specific names, one particular housing authority that I've worked with, has basically concluded after 3 years of Jobs Plus that, in order to get people into a position for real career advancement, they have to focus on upgrading their basic skills. Brought in partners that could work with people across various learning needs, from the folks who do the one-on-one tutoring, literacy volunteers, to the people who can do computer-based instruction, more along the lines of a literacy lab, where you have a proctor, you have workstations, people come in and use online tools. That basically began to open up the question with people who were working but had really basically low skills and really couldn't advance. They focused on that. They've begun to see improvement in the basic skills aptitudes of a lot of the residents, and have actually begun to see some traction in terms of moving people into better paying jobs because people have more of those basic skills that they need when they do employer assessments, even filling out employer job applications, right? So, again, focusing on basic skills as a way of really building the foundation for economic mobility.
Yeah. I would also say if there think about this from the employer needs perspective. So if there are sort of a high number of jobs in your area, that there is perhaps a small kind of targeted training that you could do, or depending on your model, perhaps even something longer. You can offer those kinds of things potentially on site. I work with a program that offers OSHA training pretty regularly, offers security guard training pretty regularly. It's built into their system. They try to have jobs available when they think people are going to get out of the training. And it's a pretty good model for saying, like, here's a job that there's a low barrier to entry, but having this additional certificate or this additional license will not just give you a leg up, but it's in many situations required. We're going to help pay for you to get this. And that's also a huge advantage, to the members who often may not be able to afford that.
And I just want to add, too, just in terms of fully sort of understanding the jobs and the specific sort of licensure or credentials needed, again, going back to labor market intelligence, there are organizations out there or companies out there. So in New York City, it's the New York City Labor Market Information Service, but there's also companies like Burning Glass and EMSI that is able to really pull data on real-time sort of jobs and again, in specific industries, and it even ties back to the basic educational levels as well as the credential levels that are needed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think we have time for maybe one or two other quick points on model components or issues of saturation and accountability and collaboration. I'm thinking I'll share really quickly on the financial incentives component. One of the things we've seen that's been tremendous progress in administering this policy is a housing authority has been able to automate their system. They no longer use paper. That's not something that happened overnight. It took some time, but it's been a significant step forward in their ability to move more quickly. As John was mentioning earlier, you want to do all possible to prevent people knowing whether they've qualified and are in receipt of this benefit. You want to minimize that time. You want to cut as much red tape as possible, and now is the time to start working on, as my colleagues have said, internal alignment for the purpose of ensuring that every department in the housing authority is on board. Along with automating it, they've streamlined it. They've developed the ability to track where an application is in the process. So I'd say that really quickly about best practices on that.
One thing I would add, because by the nature of this presentation, we've talked about each of the service strategies individually, but I'd say another best practice is when you begin to integrate them. So John spoke earlier about how the financial coaching needs to come on top of the access to the incentives. That's absolutely true. And there's many different ways you can integrate the financial coaching with the employment services, and we've seen it done a number of different ways. There are certainly natural points in an employment services engagement where you can begin to talk about different aspects of financial coaching, such as when somebody has a job, when somebody is qualifying for the ITC, how do you then plan for that additional income? But I'd also point out that we've seen it work in situations where if you have to meet the participant where he or she is. So if they're not coming in fundamentally interested in the job, but they want to deal with some sort of financial crisis, you can help them begin to make a plan to deal with that financial crisis, and then getting a job becomes part of the solution so that they have some earned income. So thinking about how you have good integration. And similarly, when Allison was speaking to community support for work, we talk about how we want to change the dialogue in the community, and we want to get to a point where people are networking with other residents about job opportunities, and how do you begin to make that part of your employment services, whether it takes the form of something like a job club, whether it takes the form of residents helping other residents in ways that you can structure, but let the residents drive.
Yeah. This is Donna jumping again. I just want to do a time check. We have another 30 minutes on the line, so I want to just correct myself from what I said a few minutes ago.
Okay.
Should we keep pushing on for some more best practices, some more specific examples with each of the components? Someone want to talk about accountability, performance management?
Well,
John, were you going to jump in?
Well, no, I was going to, I'm looking at a question that someone asked about having a community college class on site, you know, being that this is a place-based program. And while that hasn't been the case with Jobs Plus, right, that, you know, I don't think any community colleges actually come on site. You know, there have been other place-based programs that have been developed where the local community college has, in fact, done some kind of introductory classes on site. Again, the idea is make it easy for residents to get them comfortable with the idea of community college, give them one or two classes at the development, and then, you know, introduce them into the community college environment. And all of this speaks back to what to where we started. Jobs Plus is a place-based effort. If you are a PHA, you know, Public Housing Authority on this call, on this webinar, and as you think about your program, if you do not have space in your development where you can offer things like, you know, classroom space, a computer lab, space that you could make available to a partner to come on to the development to offer classes or training, then you should really start thinking quickly about how you're going to make that happen. We've seen they've literally taken two apartments and, you know, blown out some walls and try to make space that way. Ultimately, you know, it's an effort. It doesn't really lend itself to a good learning space because in the end they're apartments. But we've also seen some developments where they have a community room or a large space that they've been able to use, and it makes a world of a difference in terms of what your program looks like to the residents, because when you have space that they can go to do job search, to take basic computer classes, to just, you know, meet other people and learn how to use a computer, you know, it gets a lot of the various components of Jobs Plus working, you know, community support for work, social networking, you know, the employment training, basic skills, all of that stuff comes into play. So again, I just want to stress the importance of, you know, being an on-site place-based effort, that you have an appropriate facility that you can make available for instruction.
And this is Sharon, I just want to also add that it also gives you flexibility because you are place-based, that you have flexibility in your program design and implementation. And so, you know, again, you have to know your residents, but also you could offer programs in the evening, you know, on weekends, and be able to then engage your community college partners, depending, again, on understanding sort of the depth and breadth of the relationship, and when they offer classes or when they are available to come on site to offer classes.
And, you know, I think in terms of best practices, I'd like to go back to community support for work for a moment. And I did notice there was a question up there that was asking about, you know, potential outcomes for community support for work. And the reason those two are connected in my mind is that, you know, community support for work can be a very abstract concept to staff that are being, that are new to this program. And so I'd say a best practice there is to be very explicit in terms of what you want to accomplish with community support for work. And so it's key, actually, at the outset to say what outcomes are we going for, recognize that that'll evolve over time. Those become things that are reflected in your operating plan. And, you know, would it be possible to go back to the community support for work slide just to, you know, one of the things that I would just suggest when you look at the bullet points that were up here, you know, fundamentally, you need to get into the community. You need to understand the issues of concern for the community. You need to develop strategies to address those issues of concern. You need to think about what partnerships you need to create to enable residents to access those services or to help shape services to be particularly relevant to the residents' needs. You need to think about the ways you want residents to be engaged beyond the community coaches. How are participants becoming ambassadors for the program? How are people that are working coming back to help people that are still trying to find employment? You need to think about what's going to be relevant, what's going to be a key part of your approach, and you also have to recognize that at the outset, you're going to have to do some discovery with residents to define this. It's actually it's important for them to be part of this process and then to become part of the solution and to own that. And so I would suggest, thinking about outcomes in terms of what are the stages that you have to go through? Where are you in terms of understanding those issues? Where are you in terms of engaging them in the solutions? And then having certain, how many initiatives do you have in place? Think about it in those terms, and that will make it really concrete for the people that have to implement.
This is Donna again. I want to jump in and mention a tool that we see sites using pretty extensively right now. It's a bunch of tools, and we didn't see very much of this, 2 or 3 years ago, but social media. I think every replication site relies on some social media platform to remain connected as part of their thinking about how to do some of the things Scott was just talking about. We've seen sites get very, very creative in their use of Facebook. Some are using Instagram. Some are tweeting. But there are a range of activities that sites use. There are a range of strategies that sites have put into place that rely on their use of social media. And what's important about that, one thing that's important about it is that not all the staff are social media savvy. So it's taken teams a while to figure things out. We've actually provided some training to them. But consider social media as something you might want to build into your planning.
Yeah, I would just follow that up to say, I think one thing that we've noticed that's really, really critical for an effective Jobs Plus program, and this relates to community support for work and the use of social media, but it really relates to everything, is, figuring out what it is you're trying to accomplish and then identifying what the plan is for that. And then, and this is actually probably the most critical piece, training your staff to be able to actually implement that. We didn't spend a lot of time today on staffing, but I think it's really critical, when you think about the staff roles that, as Donna said, we'll kind of lay out in the answer of the questions, to also think about what are the characteristics of the people who should be playing those roles. Jobs Plus is not, it's not a typical employment services program. It's just simply not. It's much more about building relationships with the community, building relationships with the members, building relationships with the other key stakeholders in your local area. And therefore, it requires a different kind of person to be able to do that work. And it can feel very different than some work that, other kinds of programs, which are much more transactional. So I think it's going to be really important to look for people who really can understand the need to build relationships as part of the work, but also build relationships with an end in mind. It's a model, as Donna referenced, once a Jobs Plus member, always a Jobs Plus member? Yes. However, once a Jobs Plus member, we hope you have an evolving set of needs, right? It shouldn't be like you're in a Jobs Plus member and for 3 years we're trying to help you find that first job. This is much more about, like, let's help you find that first job and then help you get things and then help you save and then help you maybe find a second job, and really have it also being much less about the program operator helping the member and much more about the residents and the members who are involved in Jobs Plus helping each other and helping themselves, because again, a really successful Jobs Plus program is one that can leave in 5 years and has really changed the community.
And the continuum you mentioned is all about building that culture of work and making work much more dominant and something discussed and realized and participated in within the development.
Yeah. And this is Scott. To build on Allison's point and to really try and bring it home on another level, one of the things that we've experienced in the replication, we're working with some excellent organizations that are really highly regarded in terms of the employment services that they deliver. And one of the challenges for them is that they now had to implement a model that was different. It was a different employment services model. And what they had to do is they had to get staff to understand that the real challenge for the staff was to draw upon their past experience and figure out how to bring the relevant components to bear, but to shape them in the Jobs Plus context. One of the things to be wary of is staff that are used to other models just expecting that they can do this work in ways that they've been successful before, but might not necessarily work in this context.
Yes, really important. I think taking the temperature, if you will, and assessing for that up front, and if you find that, I think it's so critical to act on that right away because we've seen some staff teams kind of languish in this old way of doing business. This is definitely a new way of doing business and requires different things of them, which all really, to some degree, points to the importance of getting your staff team in place early so that you have an opportunity to come together. Individuals have not worked together before, need to get used to new colleagues, and together learn about what's different about the Jobs Plus model, what's different about them, how they will be expected to perform differently. We're just looking at the other questions here. Our adult learning theories. What if we could talk a little bit about accountability, as we've experienced as TA providers? That is, what it is that the sites we've worked with are expected to do to demonstrate their performance, and how we might advise housing agencies now to think about this in advance so that they might put processes in place to make sure that they have the ability to monitor themselves as they go along.
Sure. So this is Scott. What I would start with, tying back to some of the things that we talked about in the management and accountability slide, it starts with knowing your objectives, your strategies for achieving those objectives, and the goals, the very specific goals that you want to attain, and anchoring people in a fundamental understanding of that logic model, how you are going to deliver services to meet specific needs in order to get to those goals. And then I like to talk about accountability and coaching sort of in the same breath. What the accountability does is it really focuses people on what matters. It really makes it clear that performance and outcomes are important. But it's accountability in the context of how do we understand what's working in our approach and where do we need to address our approach. It's a very constructive engagement when it works best. Now, in order to facilitate that, you need data. The more objective the data, the better, so that the conversations can be about whether or not goals are being achieved. And then those conversations can move into what we're observing that seem to suggest what contributes to achieving the goals, what gets in the way of achieving those goals, and we can engage everybody in an empowering way in the development of those solutions. When we see programs work well, when we see programs thrive, when we see them recognize and actually follow through to capitalize on opportunities, that tends to be the approach that's at play. We like to focus as much as we can on how do you effectively engage staff to manage with data. So we talk about things like bringing data into meetings, how you look at it, how you discuss it. Inevitably, though, we end up having to have a precursor conversation where we talk about how do you get the data. And so it's just fundamental from the outset to make sure that you're thinking about what systems are you going to use to track this data, how are they set up. Staff understanding the importance of, capturing data that's accurate, that's complete, that you have folks that are in charge of the data, that are in charge of the IT system, that are paying attention to data quality, and that are able to produce the data so that it can be used in a timely manner. There's a lot of things that have to come together, and in the replication, we've had to, help sites bring all of those elements together, but the real power begins to happen when you're actually talking about how do you manage with that data and how do you use it to serve your customers better.
And just going one level up from what Scott was discussing, there's a role for the collaborative in holding the program accountable as well. So the extent to which you can get that type of system in place and working well, and your staff understanding how to use it, how to leverage it, how it helps them, you'll be much better positioned to engage with your collaborative around your performance to make sure you're doing all you can to meet the expectation they have and fulfill the vision that has been established for this particular initiative. So wanted to make sure we connect the program level accountability to that which the collaborative governance structure will be holding you to as well. A quick point, a technical point. We've been getting a message indicating that some people cannot hear. We apologize for that technical glitch. We will make this presentation available as a recording on our website. So although some folks may be going in and out or may not be able to hear us at all now, this will be available tomorrow on our website. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about saturation. Saturation is central to Jobs Plus. It's about an understanding that everyone on your team must have, that although people are going to be coming into your office for an appointment, your responsibility is really to touch everybody who lives in the development in some way. So this is a place-based program, so to the extent that your staff are going to encounter residents as they walk across the development, or if they're in a nearby store getting lunch, that's a moment, that's an opportunity to engage with people. So saturation is really about touching everybody, and we've recently seen sites try to think outside the box and be creative about how, what does saturation mean? So does it mean that, say you have 1,000 units in the development you're serving, does it mean that your goal is to serve every person in every one of those 1,000 units, or is it sufficient for your site's definition to make sure you touch at least one person each development? Do you simply touch that person by putting a flyer beneath their door, or do you enroll that person perhaps as a member, if you will, and count your saturation in that way? There are a number of different ways you can think about saturation. So make sure you give that some attention, but always keep in mind that your goal is to touch everybody, working age and others, in the development with information, messages, enroll them, make them somehow feel it's important to come into the office to receive direct services.
Right.
Yeah, Donna, I'd like to add a couple of thoughts there. Marketing 101 tells you something like 8 or 9 impressions that people need to see before they actually act. That's why we often see the same commercials on TV over and over, because it really does take a number of times for you to see it, to actually see if it really is true that 15 minutes with Geico will save me 15%. So the idea of constantly marketing to the development, to the residents, in order to have them engage with the program and become members is key. Secondly, we talked earlier in the presentation about this idea of building by building strategies, taking large developments and breaking them up into manageable chunks. One of the sites that I'm working with now has done something which I think is very useful, right, which we basically color-coded the buildings in the development so that on a monthly basis you can see how many of the working adults, right, the workforce, how many of the folks in that building who are eligible workers have we actually reached and enrolled. So, the buildings are all color coded from 10% or less to 80%. And they have different colors. You can very quickly use that to manage where do we need to pay more attention. This one particular building, it seems like, we're not making a lot of traction. What do we need to do different? Can we get the community coaches to focus on that building? So again, breaking up the larger developments into manageable chunks, being able to set targets, using data to track how successful you're being, and again, constantly marketing and using different kinds of messages, because it may be that one building has people who don't speak English that well versus another building has folks who are more fully bilingual. Whatever's going on, right, but understanding the nuances of the different buildings within a particular development.
And I just want to emphasize what John said there, because part of saturation, in order to enable saturation, you have to be relevant to the residents. So you can't do everything at once. You can't start out and be everybody, but over the life cycle of this program, you're going to want to evolve. You're going to want to reach populations that you weren't well equipped to reach early on using the type of approaches John was discussing. So keep in mind that saturation, how you define it, it's going to evolve over time. At the beginning, you're definitely introducing the program. You're understanding needs, and you're figuring out how you can provide services that are relevant. Inevitably, you're going to have to prioritize, and you'll be more relevant to some sub-segments than others. But as you want to pursue that saturation goal, you have to think about how do you get more relevant to those other sub-segments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's where you're gonna. This is Greg. I think that's where the staff that you're going to you're really going to want them to have that community credibility, because at some point, as it relates to saturation, you are going to get stuck trying to figure out, from building to building, what are our challenges in that specific building, and you're going to want to have staff that are knowledgeable on the ground and in the community about ways to overcome barriers to connecting with those potential members or current members.
Can you share, Greg, from your experience working with young men in your current, I know one of the sites you're working with right now, some are employed, some aren't. I know you had some stories to share with us earlier. Yeah, so in my past experiences working with some of the programs, they face challenges trying to create this kind of positive peer pressure, or what I call positive peer pressure, environment for the young adults in the community. But dealing with the multiple complications of things like gang violence, gang peer pressure in the community, and then how that impacts young adults' ability to access the program. And so I've seen programs get really creative and set up shop with tables inside of individual buildings to be able to really make sure that they can engage those young adults, make sure that they are able to access those young adults and have the kind of conversations they can with them. They've gotten feedback from young adults in their development that, because of some of this gang activity or gang violence, that they had fear or pressure to not go and access the program. And so, it really required a program to really think deliberately about how can we overcome this challenge of, someone being able to walk 3 or 4 blocks to come to our program to access these services. And I remember this site was able to actually figure out some strategies. There was some fear among individuals that they didn't want to make it known to their friends that they thought Jobs Plus was in fact a good deal. Okay.
One other thing that I would just mention in general, and it comes into play with a lot of these strategies, but in the replications, universally, making sure that you have good, understanding the politics of developments, understanding the politics of buildings, understanding the dynamics between the different members of tenant leadership, understanding the distinctions between the concerns of tenant leadership and tenants, and just being as well informed on all of those counts as you can, and understanding that you need to proactively plan to navigate all of that, and to always be looking across all these different channels to build support for the program so that the residents really can feel that this is a program that that truly intends to understand needs, be responsive to needs, and ultimately, become a program that really is of the resident.
And to Scott's point, this is Sharon, around responding to needs, it's important as you're thinking about your program design to think through the service strategy for specific audiences. So a young adult is very different than sort of, an incumbent worker versus an older worker. And so you want to be able to be flexible enough and adaptable enough to be able to be responsive to the unique needs of the particular target audience.
Just going to say a couple of really quick things. This is a non sequitur, but going back to the office space issue, Greg talked about this at the start of our presentation about the importance of focusing on what your program office environment is going to look like. You definitely want to set as a goal to have it have a look and a feel that's different from perhaps the employment program down the street. You want to make sure that, visually and experientially, it's distinct and different and memorable in a very positive way. This is a lesson from a replication effort that staff shared with us when we, asked them questions about the experience. And it talked about the importance of realizing that they had to have a regular office cleaning schedule. It was something that they hadn't thought about it at the start, but the restrooms and the office in general, while it was clearly well appointed, it wasn't clean. And the word of mouth started spreading around the development. So they quickly realized they've got to talk with property management and the property manager to make sure that the custodial services were coming to clean the office on a more frequent basis, a small but important detail. We've got just a couple of minutes left. I'm just going to ask if there's anyone on the Jobs Plus Assistance team that wants to share any remaining thoughts. I know, John, you're on the phone. I want to start with you, John. Any closing remarks?
No, well, yes. Jobs Plus really is a unique opportunity for public housing residents. It's a model that is, been well tested over time. And, the reality is that the devil is in the details and implementation. We've seen Jobs Plus programs that have been pretty successful because they've hired the right leadership at the front end. Like most programs, if you get the right person to lead, you'll be in great shape. If you don't, you'll be back hiring a person within 18 months. The leadership that you select for Jobs Plus has to be someone who not only has, working knowledge of what workforce development is and how you work with adult learners, but it has to be someone who can negotiate the ins and outs of working in your housing authority, especially if the person's a newcomer. If you wind up using or hiring someone who's already a housing authority employee, that has its up and down sides. But at the end of the day, this has to be someone who can work across different stakeholder groups, from residents to colleagues within the housing authority to business groups to the WIBs to employers. Really, you're looking for a kind of multifaceted, flexible individual, and most importantly, someone who can work well with ambiguity. Because one thing that we've all learned about Jobs Plus, it's not a cookie-cutter recipe. Yes, it has components, and those components are well known, but again, they get implemented, in different looking ways. And, if the person who is running Jobs Plus is someone who's comfortable figuring it out, they'll be very successful and you'll have a very effective program.
Thanks, John. We're going to hear from Scott on this end to close things out. And then I'm going to come back with a couple more things.
I would also just say, think about how you build champions for the program within the housing authority itself. These programs are an asset to property management. Their property managers and property assistants need to understand how these programs become real tools for engaging with residents around issues like rent arrears and other things of that sort, and why they should buy in and be supportive. Think about how you need to build that championing from the outset in terms of, if this program is in the community programs and development department, how do you build connections with property management? How do you build connections with resident engagement? How do residents maybe bring TPA funding, to bear to help support some of the things that the programs are doing? Just try to think holistically from the outset instead of placing it in a silo.
Sharon?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, just in terms of employer outreach and employer strategy, again, to really think through the value proposition of your Jobs Plus program and consistent messaging, regardless of where your staff sit in terms of the development, and the branding has to be very strong in the minds of employers, but also the quality of your candidates should be equally strong as well.
Okay. I want to thank everybody who has dialed in today for joining us. We really appreciate your time. We wish you the best with your proposals. We would ask that you take just a couple of minutes to complete a survey. I'm going to ask my colleague Beatrice to tell you a bit about that.
Thanks for joining us today. We would just like for you to, after the webinar concludes, there'll be a pop-up screen that will direct you to a brief survey. The survey will be anonymous, and it's going to help us get a sense of what areas were useful to you and where we can provide resources in the future.
Thank you, Beatrice. And I want to thank my colleague Emma, who's been at the helm with us today also. Thanks, Emma.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us.